Well, I think we learnt a number of things during the global financial crisis, or the Great Recession as it's known outside of Australia. We learnt that very powerful fiscal and monetary stimulus can avoid a Great Depression. And the deployment of that stimulus, particularly through the period late 2008, 2009, did avoid a Great Depression Mark II. We should be very clear about that, because there is a dividing line between those who believe that government has a role to intervene and protect their people when global demand falls off a cliff, and those who argue that really it's not the role of government to intervene in those circumstances and that laissez-faire should prevail. Now, of course, those economies that most effectively deployed fiscal and monetary policy stimulus did much better than those economies who either initially deployed stimulus and then withdrew it, namely the UK, or those economies that couldn't get a big enough package through given the magnitude of the challenges that they were facing, namely the United States. So the consequence in those economies where stimulus was either withdrawn with early austerity, or the consequence in the United States where stimulus was never big enough, there was much more capital and skill destruction in those economies and lost output for years and years and years after the London Summit of 2009, when the coordinated response was put in place. Australia was one of only 2 advanced economies that avoided a recession, and it's now 28% bigger than it was at the end of 2007. The UK is 12%, the US is 15%, and Europe across the board is only 8%. The consequence has been that whilst we didn't experience a Great Depression Mark II, what the world saw for many years following the global financial crisis was weak and anaemic growth. Weak and anaemic growth which reflected itself in higher levels of unemployment than there should have been, and certainly reflected itself in lower living standards. And of course, when living standards don't improve or people go backwards, then you get the political polarisation that we've been living with in recent years. You can see this most markedly in this next graph, which shows employment ratios across 3 countries, the US, Britain and Australia. And what that really demonstrates in that period 2009, particularly through to 2014, is the scale of the destruction of the labour market in both the UK and America, and that Australia's very big and powerful intervention through fiscal stimulus protected our labour market, protected our employment participation, and has been a source of enduring strength for the Australian economy in all of the years that have followed. But it is very clear from that graph, even though you see a temporary correction in terms of the UK, that even now the US, with an unemployment rate 1% lower than the Australian unemployment rate, still has a lower employment participation rate. And that is a legacy of the high levels of unemployment, 8 and 9%, that prevailed in the United States for years and years and years, and have only started to be reduced recently. So what that graph demonstrates is that the Americans in particular, but the UK to some extent, waded through a vast swamp of economic disappointment for years and years, 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, where living standards for many people fell dramatically, which I think then brings us essentially to the point that Gabriella was making. What the global financial crisis or the Great Recession did was shine a very bright light on income inequality which had been emerging over 30 years, and the high levels of unemployment that then came with that cracked open even more widely the reduction in living standards which are felt by vast numbers of working people across many advanced economies. This is a very revealing graph. It only picks out 7 or so advanced economies, but what it goes to is the core of the point that Gabriella was making before. What this shows is the income growth of the bottom 90% of the population across those 7 countries. 2 countries stand out as having done much better in terms of the growth in income of the bottom 90%, Australia and Sweden. Take a look at the United States. That tells you the nature of the rebellion that produced Donald Trump. Take a look at the UK. That explains in many ways the nature of the rebellion that produced Brexit. Because over a long period of time, the growth and incomes of the bottom 90% were suppressed. And after the GFC, they were tragic in countries such as the UK and the United States. So what is it about those countries that have had stronger growth, and essentially those countries that achieved stronger growth were those countries that had a fairer distribution of their national production across the great bulk of the working people in those countries. So what's a couple of lessons here? Well, we need the sort of policies that produce growth which is spread more fairly across all of the population, not just those in the top 10% that Gabriella was talking about before. And what are those policies? Well, those policies are ones which recognise the importance of fiscal policy as a structural tool to deliver the growth and the fairness at the same time. Gabriella spoke before about the IMF and its conclusions that you grow more strongly if you grow more fairly. You grow more weakly if you are more unfair. And in a sense, that makes common sense, that you can't build a successful modern economy on a shrinking share of GDP going to working people over a 10 or 20 or 30-year period. That's the common sense of the IMF and OECD conclusions about the importance of inclusive growth. What are the policies that deliver that inclusive growth? Well, first of all, there are the distributional policies, the importance of a strongly progressive income tax system, the importance of universal health and education available to people across the board, the importance of fair retirement systems. But I would argue most strongly one of the key differences is pre-distribution. And one of the key explainers of why Australia in particular has done so much better in terms of the distribution of its income over time is our industrial relations systems with a stronger minimum wage, a stronger commitment to a basic set of minimum conditions in the workforce. Unions, this is one lesson, unions are a very big empowerer and driver of inclusive growth. So if you want strong growth and inclusive growth, it requires a fair share of your national product going to labour, and that needs to be more fairly shared at the workplace level before we get to a whole host of redistributive policies that government should and must put in place to ensure that there is also intergenerational mobility. So all of these things are common sense really, but can only be delivered if, in fact, there is concerted international cooperation. It can't just be delivered at the sovereign state level. For example, if you can't have strongly progressive tax systems unless there are international agreements to deliver abolition of rampant tax evasion by multinational companies. Just one example. You can't deliver growth with equity unless trade is organised properly and fairly, and unless organisations like the ILO are taken seriously. You can't deliver inclusive growth if there's not global financial regulation which ensures that the financial system doesn't run off the rails. So I'll conclude where I began. Concerted international action did avert a Great Depression in Australia almost 10 years ago. I fear that if we were to be faced with a similar set of circumstances in a different way, that the political will for the sort of concerted action we saw almost 10 years ago wouldn't be there, because the campaign against the role of the state and the demonisation of deficit and debt around the world has reached such levels that it's almost impossible for many politicians to stump up for the hard decisions and the structural reforms that are required to deliver the inclusive growth that we're talking about today.
Thank you very much.